I want to talk to all of us who don't like change. People who don't like change in their jobs, those of us who don't like change in our families or in our just personal life or in our church, which tends to be eventually, when you get to the right subject, all of us. Because sometimes change feels like the end of the world. Speaking of the end of the world, a couple of years ago I read this article in the New Yorker that really ticked me off. It was about how all these uber billionaires, like super wealthy people, are preparing for the end of the world. And I read it and I thought, well, that sounds about right. The guy who invented Facebook turns us all on each other and then buys his own island so he can sit back and watch us destroy each other. I want to ask you a question. Do you think we are living in the last days? I mean, think about it. World War III seems like it's looming. ISIS is here. The Cubs won the World Series. And then the Nationals won the World Series. So I'd like us all to think about this for a moment. Actually, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and answer this. Everybody has to do this. You can answer. The question is, do you think we're living in the last days? You can answer yes, no, maybe, or I hate it when they make us do stuff like this. But you have to answer something. So turn to your neighbor and say something. Okay, that was a little more than yes or no. Y'all are a chatty church. So last week, for those of you who were last week, I asked you to read Luke chapter 21 and think about it. And I imagine that a lot of you who read that chapter and started thinking about the end of the world. I mean, it's a scary chapter, and for a good reason. So when we last saw Jesus, he was headed into Jerusalem. He turned over the tables in the temple because they were keeping outsiders, the Gentiles, out. And he knew this is not what God intended this religion for. And so Jesus turns over the tables in the temple. And now it's his last week alive. And like any of us who know that time is near, he spends that time intentionally. He's speaking to his disciples, trying to prepare them for something that's going to happen before he dies. He wants to prepare them for something that happens in the future. But before we talk about what Jesus is actually getting at, I want to let you know about something that actually happened that's a historical fact. It's in your history books. You can even go and see it today in the heart of Europe. In August of 70 AD, something happened that most of us don't cover in school. It was the beginning of what is called the First Jewish War, because after several decades of Rome occupying Jerusalem, the Jews had had enough. And so it started as like this little revolt and some skirmishes, but eventually it became an all-out war. And it got so bad that Rome sent in the great general Vespasian, and Vespasian lost. Because Jerusalem had all these gates, they were able to lock down the whole city of Jerusalem. And these zealots, these Jewish zealots, who today we would call terrorist or violent activist groups, they decided to band together and take Israel back. And for 4 years, it worked. They held off the great empire of Rome, and they were so happy. They even minted their own coins, and the coin said year 1. So you can see kind of how the Jews thought about what they were doing. For 4 years, they were under siege by the Roman soldiers, but they held them off. And then General Vespasian was brought back to Rome, and he was made emperor. And he knew Rome was so divided, what they really needed was a big win. So he sent his son Titus to Israel. And he said, you deal with this problem. And so Titus does. He builds a 42-mile ditch around the city of Israel. He cuts off all food and water. But it's taking so long for Rome to get into Jerusalem. Any Jew that's found sneaking out of the city to get food or water is crucified and stuck where everybody inside the city can see them, because they want them to know this is what is about to happen to you. And finally, after years and years of waiting and trying to break in, they finally break through a wall and they're ticked. Soldiers have been sitting there for 4 years and they were not happy about being there. It is not a fun place to sit outside. Some of you have been to the Holy Lands. I've been to the Holy Lands. I've been to the Holy Lands in the summer. And let me tell you, in the summer, it's hot as not holy, right? And that's what it was. It was hot in the summer. It was cold in the winter. They speak a different language. They think differently. These soldiers are miserable. And now they're going to make someone pay. Now, Titus, Vespasian's son, could have waited for the population to die on his own, but that's too good for these jerks. Titus decides he's going to use his army not just to defeat Israel, but to end Israel. His father did not send them to starve the Jews into submission. His father sent them to get a win. And so in 70 AD, as hundreds were dying from hunger and thirst, Titus storms into Jerusalem and kills almost everybody. And he so demolishes the city, including the most holy place in the world, the temple, except for one part. Because he wanted everybody who would come later to see just how utter the destruction was. He left a few rocks on top of it just so people could see how big this temple was that they destroyed. You know it today as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. That's only a small part of the Jerusalem temple. And Titus left it there so people like you could know how powerful he was. We can destroy anything. Then he razed the city of Israel so bad that no future generation would even remember the name of Jerusalem. And then the people who weren't killed by Rome, they took back on a parade. They paraded them through the streets of Rome along with the treasures, the sacred treasures like the menorah and the Torah and the things that were in the center of the lampstand. There was a triumphal procession through Rome as Vespasian and Titus watched. His point was hard to miss. This was not just a victory over a people. This was a victory over the people's gods. Most of the time when Rome defeated a nation, they would let them worship their other gods, but not now. Not after the Israelites did this. Rome said, no, you can't even bring up the name of your God. In fact, the temple tax of 2 drachmas that you used to pay to the temple, you now have to pay that to the temple of Jupiter just to rub it in. And by the year 135 AD, the name Jerusalem had all been stricken from Roman documents. And what that means is that basically in the year 70 AD, Judaism, as people had known it, stopped existing. The temple was where God was said to live, and Titus said, God no longer has a home. 1,500 miles away in Rome, when they marched those Jewish people through the streets of Rome, they actually made a giant arch to commemorate that. Titus's brother thought, this is a big deal. Titus got a big win for Rome. We should commemorate that. And so to this day, in the heart of Europe, you can go see this. This is what it says. And this is the translation of what it says. If you could go to the next slide, if it's up there. The Senate and the Roman people dedicate this to the deified Titus, or the god Titus, Vespasian Augustus, son of deified Vespasian. So there's this giant thing to this day in the heart of Europe that calls Titus the son of God. That God, of course, being Vespasian. And on this arch of Titus, if you look close, you can see this is the relief. Go to the next one. That's what they're reminding everyone we did. You can see the menorah. You can see the sacred things of us marching the defeated Jews through the city of Rome. Now, why in the world would I tell you this long, sad story? Because about a decade later, a young man named Luke sat down with a quill and wrote the first words to a gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. And he wrote it not in Hebrew, the language of God. He wrote it not in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. He wrote it in Greek, the language of the winners, the language of the heathens. He wrote, "This is the good news of King Jesus." And Luke had written, most scholars think Luke had written after the temple had been destroyed. He's one of the Gospels that wrote after the temple had been destroyed. And he tells about Jesus warning these religious people about what is going to come. And everything in the chapter, Luke 21, that you read this week is about this. Now, we Americans, we often project our own story into the Bible, and so we read like Revelation and we say, oh, those giant locusts are 21st century helicopters in Iraq. No. Jesus is actually a first century Palestinian, and yes, the Bible has something to say to us, but not first to us. Jesus is addressing real problems that they have in their day. And I want you to see, the reason I told you that story is I want you to see the Bible is addressing history, stuff that really happened in our world. So let's get started. In Luke chapter 21, we're going to start in verse 5. Here's what Jesus says. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones, with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" And Luke, before Jesus goes to the temple this time, the last time he was 12, right? I mean, other than the throwing the tables in the last chapter, the last time he was 12. And now he comes to the temple and he starts saying this. And it's hard for people in America to understand just how strange this would have sounded, because we live in a country, we think a couple of hundred years is old. The temple has been around in one form or another for 1,000+ years. And Herod, the king at the time, has been working on a renovation of it for like the last 46 years. I mean, imagine someone talking about the Statue of Liberty, the White House, the Pentagon, all the Mount Rushmore, all those things being destroyed. It's hard to conceive of America without that. But those examples pale in comparison to how important the temple was. And so obviously, when Jesus says there's going to come a time where these giant stones they're not even stacked on one another anymore, they want to know, what are you talking about, Jesus? That would be life-changing, world-changing. When's that going to happen? What are the signs to look for? And so everything in this chapter, for the most part, is addressing that question. The reason that's important is because when we read this chapter, a lot of people think, oh, Jesus is talking about the second coming and the end of the world. And for the most part, he's not. He's addressing the end of that world. He's addressing when the temple is going to get destroyed. But that's not to say Luke does not have a word for all of us today, because he does. So let's turn back and read, starting in verse 8. Question, what's the sign that's about to take place? He replied, "Watch out that you're not deceived. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' or 'I am the Messiah.' The time is near. Don't follow them. For when you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes and famines and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. And you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me, but make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourself. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Don't worry beforehand, he says. Oh, and by the way, some of you are going to die. But you won't perish, which is a really big thing to pay attention to here. Don't worry. Yeah, you're going to die. Yeah, your friends and family might disown you. But don't worry. And you're not going to perish. Death isn't that big of a deal to Jesus, so don't be afraid. And Jesus is warning them, and this is really big. This is where it starts to apply to every one of us. Jesus is warning them of this thing that seems like it's the end of the world to them. Because he's warning them because he knows that in times of shaking, that which is unshakable is revealed. Some of y'all remember, like me, September 12th, 2001. I was at Harding. Harding had shut down on September 11th, and so my 8 a.m. Bible class with Monty Cox was the first time we were officially getting back together with any groups. So I go to that 8 a.m. Bible class on that Wednesday, and Monty, before he does anything, opens up his Bible to Hebrews 12 and just reads this passage. Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, since we have a kingdom that is unshakable, let's not be shaken. And it dawned on me then, if I put my hope in the security of America or my own safety, I'm going to live on very shaky ground. There will be shakings in nations and empires and our individual lives, and our response has a lot to do with how much of our life is actually built on that which is unshakable. Do you remember what Jesus said in the previous chapter? He says to these religious leaders that are trying to kill him, I'm the cornerstone. I'm the unshakable. I stand through it all. Here's what this means. If you build your life on politics, you will be crushed when your candidate doesn't win. If you build your life on your job, you will be crushed with any job loss or any lack of upward mobility or promotions. If you build your life on religion, you'll be crushed with any change. That's what's happening here in this story. Jesus is actually warning these people, don't put your hope, don't build your foundation, don't make your foundation this temple, the traditions. One of the things that I heard when I was first coming here is that many of us people that I love and care about, that's why I'm willing to say this to you today, many of us take a great deal of comfort in church never changing. And that's why things look different here than they do with churches of Christ all over the country. In Central Arkansas, things look different here than in churches of Christ all over the country. And I immediately knew when I heard that, well, that's problematic. Because not changing isn't an option. I mean, death is a form of change, right? Dying and closing churches are a form of change. The next generation not joining in is a form of change. And maybe you've heard the numbers. They just came out last year, and they're very solid. They're also alarming that every month, 2,000 members leave Churches of Christ and 8 churches close. That happens every month. We're declining at 3 to 4 times the rate of other groups of Christians. The first question for change is that any church has to decide is not, do you change things or not? Of course, not changing is not an option. The first question is, what must never change? Answer that, and then feel free to change other stuff. See, Jesus is saying this because for 2,000 years, for thousands of years, longer than that, religious people have had this tendency to make a foundation something that is very shakeable, to take stuff that is shaky and try to make it the center. Jesus has seen this for thousands of years. This is a problem people of God have always struggled with. Let me give you an example, and it's a bizarre example, but it's also one of my favorite examples because it's so bizarre. So in the story of the Exodus, when God delivers the Israelites from slavery, after that, you know what the Israelites do over and over again? They complain like they're a bunch of fourth graders. Just complain over and over again. And so in the book of Numbers, after 5 back-to-back stories of them complaining, God sends a bunch of, does anybody remember? Snakes to bite the Israelites, which as any parent, you're like, yeah, you know, if it got bad enough, I would consider that. So he sends a bunch of snakes to bite the Israelites, and immediately they're like, oh, we're sorry, we're fine with the manna. We like manna. We're good with that. And so after, you know, they kind of repent, God does this bizarre thing. It's even more bizarre. The problem is the solution. He tells Moses, okay, take a bronze snake and lift it up, and all the Israelites who look at it, they'll be healed, which is a really strange story. But God saved them. And apparently the Israelites, they wanted to commemorate God saving them. And so they put that snake on a stick in the temple to remember the time that God had saved them from themselves. And if that's where we stopped, then okay. But something happened. There's a gap between that story and the next time we hear about the snake on a stick in the Bible. But it's a gap that I think I can fill based in my years of church and my spending my life with religious people. Somewhere along the way, that stick stopped being something that the people used to worship God and started becoming something they worshiped. Here's what I mean. I know us. I know that if you have an encounter with God one week in church, then you want to have that exact same encounter next week. If you got goosebumps singing that song on this Sunday, you want to sing that song next Sunday. If we did that ritual and we experienced God, we want to do that ritual next week. And over time, it starts to become about that thing and less about God. Not that that thing is bad, that ritual song tradition is bad. By the way, idols are never bad things. They're just good things that we try to replace God with. And so the people who had been worshiping God, thanking God for saving them with this snake on a stick, started worshiping the means of God's salvation instead of the God who saves. And that's when this happens in 2 Kings chapter 18. In the third year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places. He smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up until that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. They had started to worship the very thing that God had saved them with. But what's really haunting to me are the couple of verses right before that. Look at this. Do not forget the covenant I have made with you, and do not worship other gods. This is what God is saying. Rather worship the Lord your God. It is He who will deliver you from the hands of all your enemies. They would not listen, however, and they persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were worshiping their idols. Even while they were worshiping God, they were worshiping their idols. That's ultimately what the Jewish religious people's problems were. Their way of worshiping God was more important to them than actually worshiping God. Their religion had become their foundation and their idol. But God, listen church, this is important. God loves to destroy your idols before they can destroy you. Because left unchecked, they always do. A few years ago, I was flying to California on study break. This was back when I was at Highland. And I had this book I was reading, Bad Religion, by a New York Times columnist who's a conservative Catholic. It's a really, really great book. Anyway, I go to the bathroom. I hadn't talked to my what's that called? Yeah, seatmate, the guy that's sitting next to me. I hadn't talked to him the entire flight, but I went to the bathroom, and when I came back from the bathroom, the guy was reading the book, my book. And as soon as I sit down, I was, okay, this is different. And his first words to me are, "What are you doing reading this book?" And my response is, "What are you doing reading this book?" And so he asked me what I do. I tell him, and he asked me what the book was about. And I tell him, here's what the book is about. It's about how the problem in America isn't religion. The problem in America is bad religion. So there's a few different kinds of heresies that are floating out, and maybe some of them will sound familiar. One of them is that God is your buddy. That it doesn't matter what, God's just like a divine butler in the sky, a Mr. Rogers to kind of watch out for you. A lot of people believe in that kind of heresy. That God doesn't give the respect that God deserves. Some people, and this is another kind of heresy, believe that God is distant and engaged. He created the world, spun it up like a watch, and then stepped out. As if God's not engaged in every part of creation, as if the Holy Spirit doesn't sustain your heartbeat even now. That's another kind of heresy. There's another kind of heresy, the one I think might sound more familiar. Some people believe that God is all about getting some kind of form right. Not interested in how you do life outside of a small, select part of your week. And that one sounds familiar. And it's not just churches of Christ, but different tribes of Christians all over the world. This is a problem the people of God have always struggled with. When the how or why or when we worship God becomes more important than God or the mission of God. Did you catch what Jesus says there? This is going to happen when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What does that mean, Jesus? Well, Luke is going to spend the next 30 chapters, because the sequel to Luke is the book of Acts, and he's going to spend the next 30 chapters describing about how this Spirit leaves the temple and goes all over the world. And more than that the Holy Spirit sends people to plant churches, cast out demons, fight wizards, start riots, and other church business stuff. That there's this wild thing happening. And the primary thing that happens in the book of Acts is that the Spirit of God stops being just for Jewish people and starts being for the Gentiles. But ironically, which by the way, you're Gentiles. You're thankful for the book of Acts. But ironically, the first Christians didn't want it. So there's this story of the Ethiopian eunuch, who I think when we get to heaven, his first words is going to be, "I was also a royal treasurer." There's a story of the Ethiopian eunuch who wants to get baptized, and he's talking to Philip, who grew up as a conservative hick, something I think we can all relate to. And Philip knows that eunuchs aren't supposed to get baptized. But the eunuch says, "Here's water. What hinders me from getting baptized?" And you can feel the tension as Philip realizes God is doing something bigger than his previous assumptions. Or what about Peter in Acts? When he has this dream from God that tells him, eat unclean foods. You have no idea how many verses there are in the Old Testament about how you shouldn't eat these foods. God is now telling him you should eat. And it's not about the food. He's saying, I want you to fellowship and break bread with these people that you thought were unclean. The question that Luke is trying to tee you up for in Luke 21 is, what do you do when your religion isn't big enough for God? See, this is the central struggle for the early church. They wrestle with decision after decision of what it means to be the people of God. And by the way, aren't you glad they did? We've said we want to be Christians like the book of Acts. Well, let's be Christians like that. What is God doing, church? God's up to something. They're wrestling with decision after decision what it means to be the people of God. Not because the old system is bad. Hear that clearly. God did something. But God is now doing something again. And what the early Christians realized was that God was doing something bigger and better and more compelling in Jesus. Luke talks about the temple a lot, and a lot of times he's hard on it. Not because it was bad, but because it was incomplete. Because these people had started to think that because that was where God was, it was where God must stay. And what had started out as a way to meet God, eventually over time became a way to domesticate God. And that's why right in the middle of the book of Acts, this guy Paul, maybe you've heard of him, stands up and says to a group of very religious people, our God does not dwell in places made by human hands. There's nothing more special about this room than your living room. The Holy Spirit, the temple, is in you. It's on the move. If your religion is ever trying to fit God in a box, you're going to need a bigger box. Because no matter how big or gold or shiny or whatever this color is, whatever it is, it can't contain God. Because the truth is, as much as we might like it, God never had a box. Speaking of prophecy, when I was a sophomore at Harding, I still remember where I was sitting. Monty Cox told me one other thing. He said, he was talking to a missions class, and he said, my parents didn't want me to be a missionary. After Beth and I got married, and after we had our oldest kid, Rachel, they definitely didn't want us to go to Africa. And it actually got into a pretty big argument, so much so that they said they wouldn't come and visit us. And for 5 years, his parents did not come to see them in Africa. And then after that, they finally decided to go ahead and come. They flew to Kenya. And Monty and Beth spent the day taking them around to the different places, the different churches that they'd planted in different villages. And at one point, someone said that Monty's parents didn't want them to come. And so this lady came up to Monty and said, "Monty, I want to tell your dad this story. Would you please translate for me?" And she proceeded to tell a story that Monty himself had never heard. She said, 30 or 40 years ago, when my grandfather was an old man, he came up to me and he told me, one day there will be a white man who comes speaking your language. And when he comes, he's going to tell you a story about a great power. Believe him, because he's telling you the truth. And Monty's hearing this story for the first time as he's translating it to his dad. And all of a sudden, his dad and him have this moment where they realize this was so much bigger than what we thought. We thought it was about us just making decisions, should we go to Africa or not? And then in this moment, they realized God had been planning this before Monty was even born. And I'll never forget where I was sitting when I heard that story, because I grew up thinking God was limited to what happened in a building in an hour a week. I'll never forget where I was when I heard that story, because I remember thinking, if that's who God is, I'm going to need a bigger box. As far as that way of thinking about God, those were my last days. And that's the story Luke's trying to tell. A God who's piecing the world back together one person at a time. Look, I don't know what God is up to in Central Arkansas, but it's obvious He's doing something. And this may be the last days. I don't know. But God is at work. Church, let's stop fighting God and let's start trying to catch up with God. I'd like to invite our shepherds to take their places in the aisles. If there's something going on in your life, maybe there's a shaking going on in your life, these are godly guys. They would love to pray with you about and help your spirit remember there is something which can never be shaken, something that your life and your soul can rest on forever. They would love to pray with you. And if you're here today and you would like to put Jesus on in baptism, or you'd like to learn more about Jesus in baptism, you can come to me. I'll be standing right down here as together we stand and worship this never-changing